Good evening. Thank you so much for welcoming me here today. Thank you, Brian, for the warm introduction, the warm welcome, and for dinner. I appreciated that. I especially appreciated the mention of my brother. That was unexpected. Kind of caught me off guard. I love my brother Vicente. All right. So I'm a Catholic theologian. And because I'm a theologian, my remarks tonight are going to be theological, although we'll start off with a little bit of philosophy. My main concern as a theologian and as a university instructor is to help Christians think, speak, and argue as Christians. So today what I'm going to do is I want to introduce you to a distinctively Catholic way of speaking and arguing about disability. And that in relation to modern medicine and the questions of biomedical ethics. So at the intersection of those themes, my focus is on the Christian understanding of the human body, in particular, the goodness and beauty of our fragile flesh. So thinking about these matters is important for contemporary Catholic Christians, especially given the contemporary cultural tendency to regard the fragility of our flesh as neither good nor beautiful. So what is that contemporary cultural attitude? Well, it entails ways of seeing and ways of thinking, both of which arise from judgments about what it means to be a human being and who is worthy of our embrace. So throughout Western culture, and in some quarters of Christianity, an ideology of autonomy is promoted that makes an idol out of strength. It's generally presumed in Western culture that a fully human and flourishing life means freedom from need, freedom from limits, freedom from history, freedom from nature. We're all familiar with the ways this modern ideology of autonomy is manifest in the social sphere. The lives of inconvenient persons are snuffed out. The poor are exploited, the weak are abused, and folks who are impaired, ill, aged, they are met with indifference. What Christians sometimes overlook is how that ideology of autonomy, how it seeps its way into our everyday descriptions of the human good, our everyday descriptions of human happiness and the practices of Christian discipleship. The false freedom of autonomy, it casts a golden caricature of strength as the measure of man. It is a rationalistic, best-case anthropology that presents human flourishing as a life unfettered by the inconveniences of body, of family, of culture, of tradition, of community. When strength and independence are idolized, conditions like vulnerability, frailty, dependency, these are not accepted as part of what it means to be a human being. Rather, vulnerability and dependency are taken to be deviations from nature, evidence of a corrupt or unfulfilled existence. When strength is our idol, the normal human being is not impaired or infirm. Rather, normal humanity, natural humanity, is a splendid and imaginary ideal of carnal integrity, proportion, agility, comeliness, beauty. The Christian vision stands in stark contrast. What do we recognize? How do we see things? So the recognition that we are composite creatures, a spiritual and corporeal unity, this is basic to the Christian understanding of the human being. For this reason, a Christian doctrine on our integral dignity has always included an affirmation of the goodness of the human body. And likewise, the Christian account of the human being has always included an affirmation that the innate vulnerability of our bodies coincides with the harmony of our specific place in the good order of God's creation. In other words, Christians believe, we believe that the vulnerability and coordinate dependencies of the human body, we believe that they're essential creaturely goods. In the words of Pope St. John Paul II, quote, enduring aspects of our original nakedness, which are not in themselves a cause for shame. These are enduring aspects of our original nakedness, which are not in themselves a cause for shame. Those gifts are among the natural goods that predicate our greatest good and final perfection as incarnate, intellectual creatures formed in the image and toward the likeness of the triune God. So this distinctively Christian understanding of human nature and human dignity, it flows directly from the good news of God's love for the world, revealed in and through Jesus Christ. Where's the crucifix? There they are. There's two. You have two in here. Oh, you're so lucky. That's wonderful. That's what it flows from. The good news of God's love for the world. That is to say, Christian theological anthropology is regulated by Christian belief in the origin, history, status, and grace destiny of the human being and the ongoing act of creation. There are three things I want to talk about tonight. My presentation is divided into three parts. Let's see if I can do this. There we go. First, I want to talk about the concept of disability, focusing on the way the problem of disability is framed within the discursive mores of modern medicine and biomedical ethics. And I'll note a critique of that outlook which has arisen in recent decades from various quarters. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to survey the Christian account of our vulnerability to impairment, illness, and injury, focusing on St. Thomas Aquinas and the way he discusses the fittingness, the goodness and beauty of our natural vulnerability to impairment, illness, and injury. And then third, I want to highlight a lesson and a challenge we find in the moral witness of St. Francis of Assisi. And that's where we'll get maybe the impractical theological proposal. And I hope you'll let me know if it is impractical. If it is, then it might not be very useful. All right. Okay, so the first part. Disability, biomedical ethics, and the rule of function. So since the invention of biomedical ethics in the 1960s, the precise focus and limits, principles, and defining methods of the enterprise have remained contested matters. If anything, a consistent preoccupation with medical problems has united biomedical ethics as an interdisciplinary field of discourse. Specifically, the typical animating occasion for quintessentially biomedical ethical engagements are quandaries, controversies, and debates that arise from technological advances in medicine, the biological sciences, or developments in clinical interactions, for example, research, diagnosis, and treatment. So understood in that way, the standard aim of the biomedical ethicist is to distinguish between what should and should not be done, and to wrestle with the various moral and theoretical rationales used to articulate that basic moral difference. Disability, as a generic phenomenon, or through the consideration of particular medically disabling conditions, disability has been among the standard medical problems navigated and engaged within the discursive field of biomedical ethics. Some of the most familiar questions concern positive and negative eugenic practices, selective abortion, physiological augmentation, sterilization, institutionalized neglect, medical experimentation, healthcare rationing, the removal of life support, organ harvesting, euthanasia, and all of that with an eye toward resolving those disability-centered medical problems. Among the most prominent theoretical topics have been personhood, consciousness, the criteria of autonomy, moral subjectivity, moral agency, consent, quality of life. So, in the ordinary way that context informs content, and culture stabilizes the presumptions of discourse, over the past 60 years, the assumptions and presumptions of individual biomedical ethicists about what we mean when we say disability, these have been inflected in their engagement with the above controversies, sometimes explicitly, but more often implicitly. Likewise, those idiosyncratic assumptions and presumptions about the nature, meaning, and significance of disability, these have gone on to shape policies and practices and the professional standards of researchers and clinicians in the deliberations of healthcare ethics committees. So to raise the issue of the assumptions and presumptions of biomedical ethics is to ask about the theoretical and philosophical fonts that inform the knowledges and practices of biomedicine, Western medicine in the 20th century. Western medicine, allopathic medicine, conventional medicine. This is the thing that I'm describing. What are the philosophical fonts that inform the constellation of knowledge and practices? So we can approach that question in at least three ways. We can ask with Arthur Caplan if there is a coherent and integrated field of discourse called the philosophy of medicine, with proper guild-regulated principles, methods, and disciplinary norms. Or we can look with Bill Stempsey, who casts a wide net to capture a global sense in poetry, and art, and literature, movies, to get a global sense of the diverse disciplinary domains and discrete forms where the philosophically significant problems associated with modern medicine are identified, explored, settled, wrestled with. A third approach is we could take a cue from historians and theorists like Nancy Krieger and Keecock Lee. These are more recent theorists. Focusing instead on the historical and philosophical mores, the theoretical frameworks, that were the conditions of possibility for the unique way the biological sciences and the practices of medicine came to be associated with each other in the 19th and 20th centuries. So different from the approach of Caplan and Stempsey, scholars who take an approach like that of Krieger and Lee, that more historical approach, they're concerned with an account of modern medicine that's rooted in the assumptions of that isn't rooted in the assumptions of biomedicine. So among those folks who worry and spend their time navigating these kinds of distinctions, the referent for biomedicine is twofold. It refers to a theoretical framework and the practices whereby certainties, knowledges are derived. Specifically, biomedicine is a particular way of envisioning the relationship between the biological sciences and the practices of medicine that arose in the early 20th century and the coordinate global system of knowledges, practices, institutions, schools, industries, universities, infrastructures, all of which presume that basic theoretical framework. So, taking that view, there's generically a practical consensus about what is unambiguously within the scope of biomedicine. It's to address a disease, impairment, disorder, which is understood as something that happens to the body. Second, it's as a departure from that disease or disorder is a departure from natural healthy function proper to the human body. And it's suffered, third, by an ideally rational, autonomous, individual human being. So within the discipline, within the discourse of biomedicine, the occasion of its knowledges and practices is a current or anticipated dysfunction of the human body, a problem with the body. The rule, the standard is function, healthy function. And the goal, when faced with a problem, is a restoration of function to the degree that's possible. So because the deliberate avoidance of those elements and wanton disregard for those ideals would constitute medical malpractice, operative philosophical principles integral to modern biomedicine are set in negative relief. Understood through the lens of both the theory and the practices of biomedicine, so conceived, or so sketched, disability is a problem. Disability is a problem that belongs to an individual. It's a condition of the body, and it's a deviation or defection from what is normal, healthy, and preferred. It's individualistic, reductively materialistic in scope, and pragmatically functionalist. So I'll say a little bit more about these philosophical presumptions in a second, but it would be a mistake, at least I think it would, to characterize these presumptions as inherently problematic. They aren't necessarily bad. As is the case with any other discipline or practice, it's a virtue that the biomedical mode of inquiry and the discourse has a well-defined focus. It's a good thing. That it has a circumscribed scope. It's a good thing. That there's stipulated principles and clear goals. All that is good. The mode of analysis proper to biomedicine has practical utility. It continues to generate arresting insights concerning the human body. And it provides the practical means for the enactment of authentic goods. The problem arises, however, when those principles and those modes of inquiry and the coordinate knowledges and the ends proposed when they're amplified beyond their practical domain. That is to say, when the elements that are assumed in advance as a comprehensive account of the human being, or as sufficient for understanding the nature, the dignity, and the proper end of the human being. In other words, certain realities are obscured and others are distorted when the biomedical measure or rule of natural healthy function is reconfigured into a metaphysically stipulative delimiting principle. Basically, is a definition, or uses a definition of what it means to be a human being. So there's been pushback against this. Some of you may know about this, where the problem has been the problem implicit that I've just described. There's been attempts to reframe it. And it's come from the disability rights movement and the discipline of disability studies. So the standard origin story of the disability rights movement is typically narrated as a reaction against the emergence of biomedicine in the 19th century, and then the coordinate rise of the eugenics movement in the early 20th century. That intersection is seen as the essential catalyst for the subsequent political movements, legal efforts in the mid-20th century, and then the sociological frameworks that ultimately gave rise to disability studies as a recognized forum for academic discourse in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So any historical account is controversial. I'm sure what I've said so far, you've already picked out 5 things I got wrong. Possible. So any historical account is controversial. But here's one way to think about it that reflects a fairly broad consensus among disability theorists. This is the critical theoretical argument against the horizon of biomedicine. This is one way to put it. At the dawn of modern Western medicine in the 18th century, a novel way of classifying bodies was invented. A practical professional presumption arose in the West that scientific medical examination of a person's body captured, at least for a moment, what was truest and most determinative about that body. So occasioned by the ordinary fact that people get sick and people want to get better, and order toward the imminent medical goal of health, a materialistically monist and reductively functionalist practical distinction was formalized in the medical arts. One, it was just a rough distinction between diseased, defective, and dysfunctional bodies and healthy, normal, and functional bodies. Very practical, normal, ordinary. Now, this reductively materialist and narrowly functionalist practical division of humanity was a departure from medieval, scholastic, and early modern ways of thinking about the essential unity of human nature and the accidents coordinate with individual differences. So as the story goes in this account, in the 19th century, a new common sense emerged out of this emerging out of this conversation, this way of thinking. A new common sense emerged in the West, which was stabilized by the gradual knitting together of the practices of medicine and new novel discoveries in the biological sciences. What developed was an outlook that conflated the corporeal aspect of human nature with what biomedicine and Western culture regarded as medically typical, biologically ideal, and physiologically preferred in the aesthetic sense. So to be clear, there's nothing new or modern about the tendency to distinguish between us and them. We are so good at that. We do that all the time. What was new was the comprehensiveness of the philosophical, legal, social, institutional, and political customs that enforced the separation and the segregation of diseased, defective, and dysfunctional bodies. So this conceptual milieu is what sparked the Western eugenics movement in the late 19th century. And in the early 20th century, it's what birthed the pseudoscientific rationales animating the industrial-scale eugenic efforts to isolate or eliminate persons who were deemed to be biomedically degenerate, defective, unfit, or undesirable. Governmental population planning and reproductive controls, racial segregation, nativism, anti-immigrant policies, which were all given the glorious imprimatur of this new eugenic science. For example, in the United States between 1890 and 1920, 1925, if a genetically unfit or medically defective person wasn't euthanized at birth, forced sterilizations and abortions for feeble-minded, for the insane, for the mentally defective, these were standard. Now, of course, it's well known that the legislative frameworks and early biomedical rationale of the American eugenic movement, these were exported and appropriated throughout Europe in the 1920s, culminating the militarized eugenic program and cultural aims of Nazi Germany. That was us. We invented that. So during the second half of the 20th century, and continuing up to today, disability theorists who are concerned about the horizon presented by biomedicine have developed and advanced trenchant legal, social scientific, and socio-political critiques against biomedicine, as framed above. And in particular, against bioethics as a field of discourse. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say, and I've just picked two quotes here, it's not an exaggeration to say, as does Tom Koch, that two rival paradigms have been at odds for most of the existence of biomedical ethics as a field of discourse. Among the more incisive observations concerning that rivalry is the assessment of Susan Wendell about 20 years ago, that the animating interest of biomedical ethicists in disability, given the presumptions and ideals of biomedicine, has largely been focused on the conditions under which it is morally permissible to end or to prevent the lives of disabled persons. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the books, they fill library shelves. We're pointing out this puzzle, this problem, and it's plain as day, right on the surface. That's a horizon. Well, I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian theologian. I want to think about this in a way that reflects what God has done for the world in and through Jesus. So Aquinas, on the question of disability. Let's turn our attention to an alternative account, a different account of impairment, illness, and injury. To orient us, I'll first paint with a broad brush. I'm sure everybody knows this. St. Thomas Aquinas, he's a 13th century theologian and philosopher, 700 years ago. He lived right in the middle, imagine right in the middle of the 13th century, like 1224, 1275. I messed up those dates. That's roughly about what it is. Massive volumes, the integration of faith and reason, widely regarded as integral to the Catholic intellectual tradition. So, Aquinas remarks on the defects and infirmities of the human body, including folks who lack the use of reason, the amentibus. These are peppered and dusted throughout all of his commentaries, all of his major theological works. It's everywhere. It comes up again and again. He doesn't have a dedicated or focused treatise because it's a normal part of what it means to be a human being. So why would you have a special treatise on it? So from the Christian perspective, these themes are hardly esoteric to composite beings like us. And they were certainly not alien to the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. What we find integrated into the whole of his thought, and of particular relevance to contemporary theological engagement with disability, Aquinas' doctrine of creation, his theological anthropology, his moral theology, and his sacramental theology, they all presume the ordinary fact that sometimes we human beings are found to have impairments, illnesses, and injuries, that we get old, that we get lumpy, that we get clumsy, that our lights go out in various ways, that this is normal. So what does it mean to be a human being according to St. Thomas? Well, first of all, we're creatures, formed in the image and the likeness of our Creator, lovingly sustained in the ongoing creative act of the God who is the primal origin raised high beyond all things. We are intellectual creatures, an incorporeal rational soul, existing in and through a corporeal body, as the spiritual principle, the form of that body. We're sensual beings. We experience the world through our senses, beings whose incarnate natural happiness includes knowledge and love of immaterial truth and goodness alive in the image of our Creator. We're creatures that can be capacitated by supernatural grace to know and to love the source of all being, the triune God, the perfection of goodness, truth, and beauty, our ultimate happiness, our consummate beatitude. And yet, we are fragile. We are vulnerable. We are rational animals whose creaturely freedom is forged in the dynamic intercourse of our creaturely limitation. We are beings called to holiness and virtue, and who remain as yet burdened by the spiritual and corporeal wounds of original sin. So Aquinas' understanding of the human condition, it reflects what the church receives in St. Paul's letter to the Romans. That although our bodies are subject to infirmity and death because of sin, in Christ we are healed. From the Father and the Son, the Holy Spirit is given to strengthen us wayfarers, helping us in our weakness, interceding for us and through us in wordless groans to the Father. Physically burdened, distressed, and weighed down by decay, God's elect are called, justified, and purposed to glory. Because, according to St. Paul, nothing in creation can separate us from the love of God in Christ. So this limitation, this weakness, this complex limitation, this complex weakness is where Christ meets us. And Aquinas reminds us of this. It's where Christ meets us so that we might be healed and restored in friendship with the Creator, supernaturally strengthened in this life for holiness and spiritual progress toward our twofold end, moral virtue and the contemplative beatific vision of divine glory. That's the picture. That's the story. There's a counter-proposal here about where our weakness, vulnerability comes from. But a question lingers. A question lingers about what are we to think about this vulnerability. I'm just going to go. No. So, part 2. Aquinas on the goodness and beauty of a defective iron saw. This is, let's just turn there. So Aquinas' treatment of the fittingness of our corporeal vulnerabilities, our bodily dependencies, it appears at the beginning, at the second half of his treatise on the human being. Now it's important to note that this article in Aquinas' large treatise, this is not an accessory digression. It's not a throwaway question from the main thrust of Aquinas' discussion. Rather, this question is situated at the absolute heart of Aquinas' theological account of the human being. For that reason, his treatment of the fittingness of our corporeal vulnerabilities, the organizing principle, it drops like a thud. It drops with a bone-shaking thud when we read it, cold in its simplicity and nauseating in its implication. Here's the claim. Here's the thing that Aquinas entertains. It would seem that the body of man was not given an apt disposition. It would seem the body of man was not given an apt disposition. So to be clear, the question is not, what is the disposition of the human body? That's not this question. He already answered that question, in question 96. His answer was the incorruptible intellectual soul is united to a corruptible body, an instrument well suited to a creature that learns by way of sense. That's how he answers that. We know what the disposition of the human body is. Rather, in question 91, Article 3, Aquinas is asking, what are we to think about the human body, its disposition, in light of the gospel? Specifically, is the vulnerability of our bodies good and fitting? Is the disposition of my body, is it good and fitting? Your body, is it good and fitting? Is it appropriate to the creaturely dignity and marvelous grace destiny of the human being? A creature formed in the image and the likeness of triune God. Now, for those who are able to ask this question, one need only stand naked before a mirror or pause after bathing to feel its force. We examine our lumpy, scarred, misshaped, and inglorious bodies, our twisted bodies, our old bodies, our wrinkled bodies, our bodies that creak and break. We know the frail, weak, leaky, deformed truth of our corporeality. Aquinas doesn't pull back from the question. Rather, he embraces the question. The three objections he entertains press some of the most basic distinguishing concerns of any coherently Christian account of our vulnerability to impairment, illness, injury, and death. He asks, did God make a mistake in giving us bodies that are vulnerable? Does the vulnerability and weakness of our bodies diminish our dignity as intellectual creatures? Could the impairments, illnesses, and disorders of my body signal my disqualification or erasure from God's providential intent for the human being? These kinds of questions, these questions in particular, they shine a light on many of our most precious conceits and hidden shames. The hidden shames that we bear in regard to our own particular bodies. Because when we look in the mirror or pause naked after bathing, considering our bodies as they are, it is unnervingly easy to consider with Aquinas the possibility that God may have made a mistake. Did God make a mistake? And you could hear that question as it lingers in the dusty garden air, right? Who told you you were naked? Who told you that there's something wrong with your body? Who told you that your limitations, vulnerabilities, and dependencies are a cause for shame? So Aquinas begins his response by reframing the question. He flips it on its head. He reframes the question about the fittingness of the human body with an appeal to the artistry of the Creator, the artistry of Creator God. This is how he starts off his response. All natural things were produced by the divine art. and so may be called God's works of art. Now, every artist intends to give his work the best disposition. Not absolutely the best, but the best as regards the proposed end. And even if this entails some defect, the artist doesn't fret, doesn't worry. So to illustrate this appeal to the Creator, Aquinas gives the example of an artist, making an iron saw. When an artist, makes himself a saw for the purpose of cutting, he makes it out of iron, which is suitable for the object in view. The artist does not prefer to make it of glass, which is a more beautiful material, because the very beauty of glass would be an obstacle to the end that the artist has in view for the saw. So what does this mean? What does this tell us? What can we tease out from this? What are the anthropological implications? You read something like this is juicy. Well, thank goodness Aquinas does the work for us. The anthropological implications of Aquinas' saw analogy, they don't require speculative leaps or interpretive stretches. He immediately makes all the implications explicit. This is what he says. He says, God gave to each natural being the best disposition. Not absolutely so, but in the view of its proper end. Now, the proximate end of the human body is the rational soul and its operations. And says matters for the sake of the form and instruments for the action of the agent. I say, therefore, that God fashioned the human body in that disposition which was best, befitting to such a form and to such operations. So what's going on here? What is he saying? How is he answering this bone-shaking thud of a question? So there's something at stake here. Aquinas is concerned to reconcile the innate vulnerability of the human body, the defect, impairment, illness, injury, disability. He is concerned to reconcile that with the Christian presumption that the human being, composite creature, has an honored place in the good order of God's creation. The reason this argument needs to be made has to do with the tendency to regard the defects of our bodies and the bodies of others as repulsive and ugly, unnatural and unfitting. In other words, he needs to make this argument. It needs to be made because many of us have a tendency to regard our vulnerability, the vulnerability of others, to impairment, illness, and injury as an unnatural and ugly aspect of the human condition. Now, to be clear, Aquinas is not saying that impairment, illness, and injury, he's not saying that these are bodily goods. There's something that's missing. There is a lack. Rather, his contention is that they are fitting. They are beautiful. They are good, given the dignity and grace destiny of the human being. We can unpack this a little bit further. When it comes to the defects of the human body, Aquinas challenges Christians to attend to and appropriate the practical insight and intent of the architect of creation, the master artisan. What he's doing here is he pulls out from the question and talks about efficient and final causality, the whence and the whither of our bodies. He puts our bodies in a story and in relationship to the intent, the providential intent of the Creator. We can think about this in terms of aesthetics, and there are Aquinas has this aesthetic theory that's functioning in various places throughout the Summa. It's inchoate, it's not fully developed, but it's there. In terms of integrity, proportionality, and clarity, we can break it down in that way. The integral perfection of the human being is not indexed solely to her or his status as an intellectual creature. This is our form, right? Rather, our integral perfection is indexed to the actualized intent of the Creator. What the Creator wants for this thing that he made. As that person lives and breathes, accidents and all, leaky, lumpy, wrinkly. Aquinas calls this the first perfection of the human being, as that person lives and breathes. Now, coordinate with that, the proportionality or fittingness of a particular human being isn't indexed solely to the transient splendors and corruptions of other bodies. Rather, the fittingness, the beauty, the goodness is indexed to the final end, purposed by the Creator. What is the final end? What is the exemplification of the final end? It's exemplified in the resurrection glory of Christ's scarred body, the glorified wounds. For Aquinas, the Creator's ultimate intent for the human being is a perfection and contemplation that cannot be frustrated by bodily defect. Rather, as Aquinas argues elsewhere, concerning the extensive increase of beatitude in the resurrection life, the perfection of the blessed in a likeness unto God according to image, what he contends is that this is a God-likeness of the comprehensor, the one who comprehends and participates in the beatific vision. And according to St. Thomas, it is a God-likeness that will extend or overflow from the beatified soul to the resurrection body and will be manifest in the glory of those bodily wounds that have been united through the bond of charity to the suffering of Christ. He picks up the thread here in his treatment of how our wounds and scars will be reflected in the resurrection body. And he speculates with St. Augustine of Hippo that those that have been united with Christ, they'll be there as crowns, as beauty marks. Aquinas calls this the final perfection of the human being, manifest in the resurrection body. So, from the perspective of the Creator of humanity, corruptible flesh is the best material for making an intellectual being that is purposed to learn through sensation. Even though flesh is vulnerable to defect and lacks the superficially attractive splendor of invulnerability. A seemingly invulnerable and defect-free body could be considered beautiful in a narrow sense, as our culture would want us to think. Such a body would ultimately be unable to function in a way that is perfective of the human being. An invulnerable body would lack the integrity and proportionality proper to the intent of the Creator. And that invulnerability would be an obstacle to the ultimate or final telos of the human being. For Aquinas, when it comes to the Christian account of the human being, there is no more determinative argument, theory, or framework than the bedrock of our faith in the providential goodness of the Creator. And it would also seem that for Aquinas, there is no more determinative argument, theory, or framework for the determination of the fittingness of our vulnerability than our faith in the providential goodness of the Creator. Now, Aquinas acknowledges that we have a tendency, and that there's a tendency of some to see some people as beautiful and others as ugly. But at the center of his treatise on the human being, he lays out a framework for describing and recognizing a beauty that one must learn to see, one must learn to apprehend. Just as an apprentice would need to learn to apprehend and discern from a master craftsman. 3. So receiving the fullness of the Christian account of the goodness and beauty of our fragile flesh, it is more than merely collecting a bunch of texts and theological reminders and arranging anthropological principles from the Christian archive. That is not what it means to receive the fullness of the Christian account of our fragile flesh. That's just paperwork. What it involves the formation and habituation of our aesthetic sensibilities, our ability to recognize beauty. So in the case of Christians who practice the medical arts, which is something that happens here, especially in contemporary culture, I want to suggest that the formal coherence and precision of any particular interpretive or speculative work on health, wellness, and bodily flourishing, maybe it could be enriched through a discipline of moral conversion by way of encounter and embrace towards the transformation of one's aesthetic sensibilities. So, thinking with Aquinas, it would be an apprenticeship at the feet of the master craftsman, the creator of vulnerable creatures like us. And it would be placed in a position in order to learn to see the beauty that God sees. So to hold forth that our fragile flesh is good and beautiful, just as when we affirm the beauty of Christ's passion, this is to lay claim to a distinctively Christian vision of beauty. We talk about the beauty of the cross. It's a distinctively Christian vision. And we would have to lay claim to a kind of formation that would allow one to recognize such beauty. It would require a very specific kind of formation. This kind of skill of aesthetic perception is well illustrated in the effective transformation and moral conversion experienced by St. Francis of Assisi. Hopefully you can see that. I'm going to read it. I think we're good. Yeah, we're good. I'm going to read it. One day, Francis was praying enthusiastically to the Lord. He received this response. Francis, everything you loved carnally and desired to have, you must despise and hate if you wish to know my will. Because once you begin doing this, what before seemed delightful and sweet will be unbearable and bitter. And what before made you shudder will offer you great sweetness and enormous delight. Well, Francis was overjoyed at this and was comforted by the Lord. One day, Francis was riding his horse near Assisi when he met a leper. And even though he usually shuddered at lepers, he made himself dismount, and he gave him a coin, kissing his hand as he did so. After Francis accepted a kiss of peace from the leper, Francis remounted and continued on his way. He then began to consider himself less and less until, by God's grace, he came to complete victory over himself. After a few days, he moved to a hospice for lepers, taking with him a large sum of money. Calling them all together, he kissed the hand of each, and he gave them alms. And when he left there, what before had been bitter, that is to see and to touch lepers, it was turned into sweetness. With the help of God's grace, he became such a servant and a friend of the lepers that, as he testified in his testament, he stayed among them and served them with humility. I want to ask you something. What exactly did St. Francis see? What did he see? Did he undergo some bizarre distortion of his sensory experience of the world, such that a truly revolting sight and revolting smell was deceptively veiled and perfumed? Or rather, could it be that St. Francis, in the process and the journey of considering himself less and less, he was simply undergoing an ordinary process where he had victory over the most precious conceits and hidden shames we bear in relationship to our fragile, wounded bodies and the fragile, wounded bodies of others? In other words, it could be said, Francis learned to recognize a goodness and a beauty that is easy to ignore and easy to avoid. I want to suggest that the beauty St. Francis came to apprehend is the innate dignity and fitting purpose of the particular bodies of particular persons in the good order of God's creation. So understood and interpreting St. Francis through St. Thomas Aquinas, I'm sure something exploded right there. But this is one of the ordinary transformations capacitated and pro-offered by Christ to the church in the sacrament of confirmation. I have in mind the kind of affective transformation that's available for every Christian to accept or reject in response to our own vulnerability and the vulnerability of our neighbor. There stands an invitation. an impractical theological proposal, but it's more than words, right? It comes from Christ. There stands an invitation, one that prompts a personal response. Rather touch or withdraw from the beauty eternally revealed in Christ's passion, celebrated in the Eucharist and offered to doubting Christians in the splendor of Christ's glorified wounds. Just as Jesus said to the Apostle Thomas, Thomas, put your finger here. What difference would it make if those of us who practice the medical arts learn to recognize the goodness and beauty of our fragile flesh from the perspective of the Creator? And how might a refusal to learn to see in this way affect our work? And considering the path charted by St. Francis, how might a refusal to think beyond the reductive principles and functionalist ends of biomedicine render one incapable of enjoying the great sweetness and enormous delight that follows when we serve those who are impaired, ill,